somebody will start it with words something like, remember the time? And then you all start to chime in, and if the story starts to go wrong, somebody will correct and say, no, that's not how it happened. And nobody takes it as an insult. It's rather just a recreation of this special moment in your lives together, and everybody's part of it. It just feels nice to relive that moment, that time, that experience together. So far, 3 times today, we've referred to a story. This story, our story, our family story. Our stories, those that we tell around the table at celebrations, those that we tell when we need to rely on one another, those stories that we tell that help us to get a sense of identity. Our stories, whether they're family stories or group stories or even this story, they remind us of who we are, of where we have come from. Maybe give us a sense of direction as to where we are going. And most importantly, I think our stories tell us to whom we belong. And throughout our lives, as we experience new things, both things that bring us joy and things that bring us grief, we create new stories. We tell those experiences. Certainly, if you have visited somebody who is standing by a loved one in a funeral home, they're anxious to tell you again about the circumstances of their last days or weeks and how they got to this particular point and what it meant. And each moment along that point of their journey, because it's important for them to be able to start to tell this story, to make sense of what they've just experienced and what they're continuing to experience. And so they create a new story. Or somebody's given birth to a child and they want to tell you all about what the pregnancy was like and how this new child is such a blessing. And that story gets told and it becomes a more and more beautiful story as the pieces start to fit into place. And we tell those stories, these momentous stories and these everyday stories, to remind us of who we are and where we have come from and where we're going. And most importantly, to whom we belong. And so today, as the church family, we tell our story again. This story, this most important story, this central story. And you will have recognized by now, as we talk about stories, that stories are not something that's made up, but these stories that we tell touch us deeply. These stories connect to the root of who we understand ourselves to be. These stories carry that most important thing for us as human beings. These stories carry meaning. Deep meaning. Meaning for us and meaning for the human community. Meaning for us as a family together to hear that story. This is our story. But it's not just a story. It's history. It's meaning. It's contemporary. It happened today. It happens again. It will happen tomorrow. And we tell this story in different ways, with sometimes one correcting the other. If you read through the Bible, you'll notice that there are 4 versions of this story: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And they basically have the same story, but sometimes they'll disagree in the details. Because everybody has their own perspective. It's just like a family gathering around the table. No, it wasn't a Monday, it was a Tuesday. No, it wasn't that person, it was this person. But the story itself, the heart of that story, the meaning of that story, the purpose of that story is always the same. Our stories unite us. Our stories give our lives meaning and purpose and remind us. Today we tell this story. And we're going to tell it again throughout the week because we need to remember. And we need to feel the power of this story, which though the story itself is 2,000 years old, the power of that story is as new today as it was when it was first told. As new as when the first person hears it for the first time and feels their lives transformed, changed, called into question, redeemed, shaken up, transformed again. See, what's beautiful about this story, what gives it extra meaning and impact, is that it's not just our story. It's God's story. It's a story that God wants us to know and hear and tell and feel. It's a story that God calls forth from our hearts and our voices again and again. It is God's story, and therefore it is our story. And I wonder if you noticed something about the story that we told this morning. The story that we acted out before you, the story that was made real in the people that shared their time. Did you notice something? The story didn't end yet. The story isn't finished. That is certainly true of God's story. Of God's story with us, of God's deep love for us. It's not over yet. Maybe that's a story that has no ending, but we do know that something more is coming. And so I invite you to immerse yourself in the events of this week, to immerse yourself once again in the details of this story, which is not a story just for someone else, but is a story for you. It's your story. It reminds you of who you are and where you have come from, where you are going, and most of all, this story reminds you to whom you belong.